It's days like today where prayers like Guy's a minute ago hit different, especially the part of help us to listen attentively. It hits different. And I've told 2 people before, already, 3 people already. And I'll tell you all again, I don't care if you sleep or not. I told Jeff, that's between you and the Lord, and I just don't enter into that equation. It's questions and answers, which will help me to stay awake. Being up here helps me to stay awake. What's your excuse? I thoroughly enjoy getting your questions. And I say that a lot, but I do, because many times your questions make me think about things. I've gotten many questions that I've not thought about before. I've gotten questions that I know the answer, but I don't know right off the cuff how to get to that answer. And so you make me dig. My notes are, believe it or not, more extensive than the answers that come out up here. By nature, it's that way, I guess. But it also, I think it also goes to show that you ask questions that we can look into very, very deeply. We can study some of these questions and get a lot of information that has to do with answering these questions, and not be able, when we're sitting in a room like this, in a setting like this, to get into every aspect of this. And so, as you have questions in your own personal Bible study, bring them. I want to see them. I love to see them. Even if you think that you have the answer, and if you just want to hear another answer, bring it to me. If you think you have the answer and you think that that answer needs to be shared, bring it to me. I don't care. Bring me the questions. I love to have them, and I love that maybe I can help. That's part of the preacher's job, is to help, especially when it comes to your Bible knowledge. Part of the preacher's job is to help make sure that you have the Word of God before you, that what God says is taken into account. And so it's my job to present that to you. And if you're having trouble finding the answer to some Bible question, bring it to me. Let me do my job. Don't keep me from that, or I'll just have to get up here and preach a sermon and guess on what you need. But in doing this type of setting, I get to know exactly what's on your mind, and I get to address those things directly. We do have several, but we'll get through them quick. So if you have questions, bring them to me. You know the drill. Text me, email me, call me. There's a box out in the front. I've got a mailbox, if that works for you. I have ears, and they work, so come and talk to me. If we go over some answers and you think there's more to talk about, or maybe I didn't answer the question in the way that you would like, or maybe I didn't answer the question at all, you think, hit me up. We'll go eat lunch and we'll talk about it, and we'll sit and uncover all the aspects that we can together. That's the purpose of this, is to help us learn together. And it's part of, and I'll quote 2 Peter 3:18 a lot on these questions and answers days, but it's part of growing in our knowledge of God together. We all ought to be doing that, and that's how I see this session helping us to do, is to grow in our knowledge together. So let's dive in. We've got several really good questions queued up for us. The first one is, do animals go to heaven? And I think this is a great question. I really do. How many of you have pets? Multiple pets? Do you love your pets? You bet you do, or you wouldn't have them, right? You bet we love our pets. And so it's natural to wonder, am I going to get to enjoy that companionship into eternity? And this question has been debated back and forth for a very long time. I do believe the Bible has an answer to this question. but I also understand that we have to do a lot of extrapolation. And there's a couple of ways that people have handled this in the past. One way I'm not a big fan of. One way is to say this: well, animals don't have souls and humans have souls, and the answer then is no, that animals don't go to heaven. I'm not a big fan of that method, and I'll explain why. If you'll open up to Genesis chapter 2, let's say. In Genesis chapter 2, where I'm looking at verse 7, where the text says that the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Now the question is around those last two words. He became a living being. And what we'll do is sometimes we'll go to this verse and we'll say that man became ensouled. God formed his body from the dust of the ground, and then he breathed into his nostrils, and he had a soul. And so he became alive. And so we'll say, see, there that God breathed into his nostrils, and so man has a soul, but animals do not. The problem with this line of reasoning is that the same words that are used to describe Adam in Genesis 2:7 are used several times, especially in Genesis, of animals. And so, for example, you get over into Genesis chapter 6 and 7 and 8, and you'll start seeing where God says of animals that they all will perish, all of the animals, the cattle and the creeping thing, and all of those in whose nostrils is the breath of life. And you can even get over into Genesis chapter 1, and you can find where the text there describes living beasts, I think maybe the King James or New King James says, but the Hebrew words are the same as in Genesis 2:7. There is some sense in which animals possess a soul to some kind, and we could debate forever what exactly all of that entails. The real question is, do animals have an eternal or immortal nature, in the same sense that humans have a nature that will live on in eternity? And the answer to that question is no. And I think the verse that we should go to instead is not Genesis 2:7, but Genesis 1:26 and 27. Because there is something special about humanity when God creates them. In Genesis 1:26 and 27, we're told, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the cattle, over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." And so God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him. Male and female He created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, every living thing that moves on the earth." And so God reaches a point in His creation where He has created everything else, and He stops and He purposes to create something unique, something about which He says, something He says about them that He does not say about anything else, that He creates man in His own image. And therein is the idea that we are beings in a similar sense that God is a being, that God is a person, a personality. And so He is this being who has agency and choice and will. He has the ability to do things. He has an intelligence. He has the capacity for reason and for learning and for wisdom and the application of that wisdom. He is a communal being, and so a societal being, and so He is all the time seeking fellowship with His creation as we seek fellowship with one another. And these are qualities that you do not see among animals because they are different. Now, does that mean that animals don't matter? No, that's not at all the idea. In fact, throughout the Old Testament, we are encouraged, by the way, for example, in Proverbs chapter 12, to treat our animals well. And that is a demonstration of godly wisdom, to treat your animals well. And so we We are different. That's the bottom line of it. I really am glad that God has blessed us with the kind of companionship that animals give us here on this earth. But I do believe the Bible teaches that humans go and enjoy fellowship with God. If I am wrong, then I'm wrong. And what have we lost? If God says that animals will be there, okay, whatever. But I think you're going to have a hard time demonstrating that from the Bible. Let's go to Matthew 10, 41 and 42. We've got a question that simply asks to explain this text. So, to that text we go. Matthew 10, 41 and 42. I'm going to read 40 through 42 because that really gets us more of the context. He who receives you receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me. He who receives a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. And he who receives a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man's reward. And whoever gives one of these little ones only a cup of cold water in the name of a disciple, assuredly I say to you, he shall by no means lose his reward. Well, what does this mean? Well, this is in the context of Jesus giving what we sometimes call the limited commission. He is telling his disciples the extent of their ministry while they were with Jesus. And so he tells them, don't go to the Gentiles, but you stay among the Israelites, you stay among the Jews, go and preach to them. And he tells them, here's what you're going to preach, here's what you're going to do, here's how to handle these and those situations. And here, right at the very end, he's basically giving to the disciples how people might respond and the kind of message that they ought to be preaching in terms of an invitation or an exhortation. And what Jesus is doing here is he is saying, whoever receives you is receiving me, because Jesus sent the disciples. It's the same logic that Jesus applied to himself. If you receive me, then you receive God, for God sent me. And as Jesus bore the message of God, if they received that message, then they received God's message. Well, it's the same thing. And so if people received the disciples who were sent by Jesus with Christ's message, then they were really receiving Christ and his message. And whoever receives you receives me. Whoever receives me receives him who sent me. And so you have kind of this almost a transitive thing here. If I receive the disciples of Jesus, then I'm really receiving Jesus. And if I receive Jesus, then I really receive God, because ultimately it's God's message being sent here. The idea then in verse 40 is that the disciples were carrying a message that came from God. And so, verse 41, whoever receives a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. Whoever receives a righteous man in the name of a righteous man receives the righteous man's reward. If you accept the message of God sent through his agent, a prophet, a righteous man, these disciples being sent out, you will be rewarded with that messenger of God. And so if you receive the message of a prophet and obey him, then you'll receive the prophet's reward. If you receive the message of the righteous man, then you'll receive the righteous man's reward. And so there would be the preaching of this gospel, this message that God had sent through Jesus, through the disciples. And if people received the message of the disciples, then they would be rewarded together with the disciples, with the same reward. And you see this carried over again in verse 42 in some more practical language. He says, whoever gives one of these little ones only a cup of cold water in the name of a disciple, assuredly I say to you, he shall by no means lose his reward. Will God definitely reward those people who obey his message? And the answer is yes, he absolutely will. Even if what you have to contribute to spur on the message is only a cold cup of water. That's it. You can receive a reward for the service that you yield in speeding the message along. And so that's the idea. We've got here then a passage that teaches us that those who accept the message of Christ will receive the reward that God has set in place for it, with it. And even if our service amounts, according to our standards, to a small amount, even if my part is only to give a cold cup of water, then I will be rewarded even for that. Next question is in 2 Corinthians 10, verse 6. And the question here is, who was punishing who and why? Well, in 2 Corinthians the whole book is written as a defense of Paul. It's Paul's self-defense. And so you had some in Corinth from the time that Paul was with them to the writing of 2 Corinthians, which probably was something between 2 and 4 or 5 years max. So not very long after Paul left did he write 1 Corinthians, and we know that 1 Corinthians was 1 year after. It's the other way around. 2 Corinthians was 1 year after 1 Corinthians. So it's not been very long. And yet there are people now in Corinth who are saying, Paul's not who he said he was. He claims to be an apostle, and yet he came, and when he preached to us, he was all weak-kneed, and he was frail, and he was scared, and he's not a very powerful person, but now that he leaves, he writes all these harsh letters to us, and his bark is worse than his bite. And Paul, in 2 Corinthians, defends himself in a number of ways, mainly sticking by this idea that says, I proved myself when I was with you. I showed you all the signs of an apostle. You know who I am. And besides, at one point in 2 Corinthians, he says, you are my letter. You want a letter of recommendation to me? You are my letter of recommendation, because who I was with you is who I am. I proved myself to you. And now, by the time we get to 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 6, where Paul says, being ready to, that he's going to come, being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled, he's kind of sprinkled this idea throughout the book, that when he comes, there are going to be some people who are very sorry to see him come, because he's not going to come very happy. And when he talks about showing all the signs of an apostle among them, probably what he was referencing in context is his ability to perform miracles and to give miraculous abilities to others. And if he's able to perform miracles, and you might reference, is it Elymas the prophet that he strikes blind for speaking against him in the book of Acts? If he can do things like that, what can he do to these people who are hindering the gospel among the Corinthians? That's the idea. Paul, in this book, warned them, I don't want to come bearing a rod, but I will if I have to. And so Paul says, yes, I'm going to come because the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds and casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. What he's getting at there is, when I come, we're going to have a serious discussion. We're going to find out who's saying the truth here. And so Paul's going to put these people to the test, and if they fail that test, it's going to be sore for them. Because when he comes to perform this test, we're going to see whose arguments win out. I'm also ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled, because some of you are going to hold true to the end. And when that time of testing is over and your obedience is filled up to the brim, we've reached that point where your obedience is topped off and you've passed this particular test. Now we're going to find out who's who. So Paul was getting ready to punish some people there who were there in Corinth. We might also, another way of reading this would be that this would be God's readiness to punish at the judgment day. I tend not to take that. I think more context, this way Paul punishing these people is a better way of looking at it, but it is another way at least. All right, let's cover another question. We've got this one. Did God hear the prayer of Cornelius? And let's go to Acts chapter 10. This is one of those rare instances in questions and answers forums where we get to answer the question because the text just gives us the answer. It's a rare thing. I like it. Acts 10 verse 4. Here's this angel that has appeared to Cornelius, and when Cornelius saw him, he was afraid, and he said, "What is it, Lord?" And he said to him, "Your prayers and your alms have come up for a memorial before God." Did God hear Cornelius' prayers? Well, yes. Or else his prayers could not have come up as a memorial before God. There you go. I mean, that's what the text says. Now, I do understand where the question is coming from, because if we go over to the book of John, chapter 9, we're going to run into a question. And I think probably in John 9, about verse 30 or 31, I think this is the real question behind the question. If I can try to read between the lines here a little bit, I think this is the question behind the question. Because in John 9, we've got Jesus healing this blind man on the Sabbath, and then the Pharisees notice, hey, this man's not blind anymore. How'd that happen? And the man told them, well, Jesus of Nazareth came, and he put his hands on me, and he healed me. And they said, well, no, he didn't, because we don't know where he gets his power. And here's the man's answer to that question. The Pharisees say, well, the Pharisees, in verse 28, they reviled this formerly blind man and said, you're his disciple, but we're Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this guy, we don't know where he's from. So where did Jesus get his power? Because Moses got his authority from God. So where does this man get his authority from? And here's the man's answer. He says, why, this is a marvelous thing that you do not know where he's from. How can you possibly not understand where this guy is from? Yet he's opened my eyes. It should be obvious, isn't it? I mean, I was blind and I can see where this man's from, and you can't? Kind of the accusation there. Now, we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does His will, He hears him. So you tell me, Jesus called upon God to heal me, and God healed me. Where is this guy from? And he says that one line that causes the question, that God does not hear sinners. Well, what does He mean? That's the question. What does He mean, and what do we mean when we ask, does God hear Cornelius, for example? Well, what this man meant was heed. And we sometimes do that too. We sometimes use the word hear to mean heed, or listen to, pay attention to, give weight to what I'm saying. And that's how this man is speaking. Jesus called upon God to heal me, and did God heed that prayer of Jesus? And the answer is yes. Well, God does not listen to sinners in that way. If you are an enemy of God, is God going to pay attention to what you ask? Is God going to pay attention to what you want Him to do? Well, no, that's the idea. We have some passages in the Old Testament that help us figure this out. And for example, in Proverbs 15, down about verse 29, we read that the Lord is far from the wicked, but He hears the prayer of the righteous. And the idea is, God is far away from the wicked. He's not there to help them. But when the righteous pray and ask for help, God is there. He hears those prayers. He heeds those prayers. In Proverbs chapter 1, we have wisdom speaking here, but I think it's fairly easy to kind of put God in this place too. That's kind of the interplay in Proverbs chapter 1 there. When in Proverbs 1:28, wisdom says, then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me. Well, how does wisdom know they're calling on her if she does not hear? Well, she hears, she just doesn't care. You didn't want to listen to me, so I'm not going to listen to you, is the idea. You get this, by the way, in the book of Job, in Job 27, verses 8 through 10. For what is the hope of the hypocrite, though he may gain much, if God takes away his life? Will God hear his cry when trouble comes upon him? Will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he always call on God? And so you have this hypocrite who is not interested in God, and yet when he needs help, he's going to call out to God for help and say, well, help me, God. Well, what's God going to do? Well, what hope is there for the hypocrite? There is no help. Well, can he rely on God? No, he can't rely on God for that. But can the righteous? Yes, the righteous can rely upon God. You get Job 35, 12, and 13. There they cry out, but he does not answer because of the pride of evil men. Surely God will not listen to emptiness or vanity, nor will the Almighty regard it. And I like the way he words that there. He won't regard it. And so they cry out to God for help. But why should God help? You didn't listen to me, God says. So why should I listen to you? That's the idea. But Cornelius is not a person who doesn't regard God. In fact, in Acts 10, verses 1 and 2, we find that Cornelius is a devout man. He is one who fears God, gives alms always, and prays always. Here is a man that we might describe as a God-fearer. He's a fearer of God. He's not a Jew. He's not living. He's not in that covenant with God. as it was in the Old Testament. But he does respect God. He fears God with all his household. He gave alms generously to the people. He prayed to God always. And did God honor Cornelius' prayer for help? Yes, he did. What did he do to honor his cry for help? He came and he told Cornelius, go find Simon Peter, who, Acts 11:14, will tell you words by which you must be saved. We got another example I can give you over in Acts chapter 9, where Paul was praying. Paul meets Jesus on the road to Damascus, and Jesus tells Paul, you go on into Damascus, and there it will be told to you what you should do. And then God appears, or Jesus appears to Ananias, and Jesus tells him, arise and go to the street called Straight, and inquire at the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus, for he is praying. That's verse 11. God heard the prayer of Paul, and what did he do? He sent Ananias to go and preach to him and tell him what he must do. Which raises a point, because a lot of times what we'll do is we'll use this idea in John 9. And what we'll do is we'll bring up this whole, well, God doesn't hear the prayers of sinners, as a refutation of the idea of the sinner's prayer. I can pray and be saved by that prayer. And I think what we do is we over-apply the definition of the word. That God doesn't hear it, and we almost pretend as if God is deaf, that He literally just goes deaf when people pray, and that's not the case. He just regards some prayers and not others. I want to point out, too, that with regard to the sinner's prayer, you have two people who are lost and in need of salvation, and they are actively praying. And how does God answer the prayer? He sends someone to them who will preach the gospel and tell them what they ought to do. And on both occasions, in Acts 10 and in Acts 9, both of those people were not told, continue praying. In fact, Paul was told to stop praying. Stop praying, because here's the answer. You can get up and do it now. And he was told in Acts 22:16, why are you waiting? Arise, be baptized, and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. And so calling on the name of the Lord is not praying. Calling on the name of the Lord is, in this usage of it, in this way of speaking of it, me finally getting up and doing what God has told me to do. And so, did God hear the prayers of Cornelius? The answer there is yes, and He will hear your prayer too. If you are someone who is seeking God, if you are someone who is honestly trying to find Him, to follow Him, to please Him, He will hear you too. If you are praying to be guided to the truth, then be guided. Be guided to the truth. And when you find it, stop waiting. You have your answer. Call on the name of the Lord. Now, if you need to do that by being baptized today, then we can help you with that. If you need to do that by coming home because you're His child but you've been far away for a long time, what I find really interesting is in Acts 14, or Acts 17, when Paul said, it's one of the two chapters, when Paul said that we're calling on Him, and yet He is not far from any of us. He's not far. And if this is the answer to your prayer, and if you've been praying for salvation, here's the answer to your prayer. Heed the call now.